walk us through how you are reading the developments with the ceasefire and exchanges of hostages on both sides?
If we look at what Trump has said and statements made by Israeli regime officials, it seems that the ceasefire may not last, and that the Israeli regime, as usual, is not sincere about preserving the ceasefire. We've seen that in Lebanon as well. Right now, the uh, Netanyahu regime has refrained from pulling out of those small areas in southern Lebanon, which they were able to occupy, even though they were supposed to do so within 60 days. And the regime has a long history of violating commitments. After all, it's a regime that carries out genocide. So commitments for it don't mean anything. It has the backing of the United States. It has the backing of NATO and Western uh, countries. So it feels that it can do anything. So at the moment, uh, it's unclear where things are, but I am not particularly optimistic.
I wanted to ask you that there are some people, including platforms that we deeply admire, like Electronic Intifada, um, who are telling us that it's at the ceasefire is at least a moment of small victory for the Palestinians. There are others also on the pro-Palestinian side who say that it's a bit unfair to think about this as a victory given the scale of destruction and genocide that Israel just got away with under the nose of everyone in the world. I was wondering, how do you see at these two narratives?
I do believe that this was a significant victory and that the Israeli regime has been humiliated. After all, we've seen that they've attempted for over 15 months to wipe out the resistance and to wipe out the Palestinian people with no success whatsoever. Um, and I also believe that the genocide or the Holocaust in Gaza is a defeat for the Israeli regime. What has destroyed Israel in the eyes of the world is the fact that it is presented itself as a racist regime that is willing to slaughter a people, a whole nation, women and children. Their leaders have called Palestinians Amalek. Their leaders have said that there are no innocents in Gaza, which includes children. Their leaders have said they're going to, from the very beginning, that they're going to block food, medicine, water, and all necessary goods for survival from getting into Gaza. They've made many genocidal statements uh, openly. That was well documented and presented a long time ago by the South Africans when they put their complaint forward. And their actions have shown that there's a great deal of consistency between their behavior and their statements. So I think that is a major defeat for the regime. It doesn't see it that way because it is a very racist and ethno-supremacist regime. The West may not like to see it that way, but that's because they support racism. But the rest of the world and many ordinary people in the West do see what's really going on. So I consider that to be even a greater defeat for the regime and the ability for it to succeed in the future. I do understand the point that people make that it is the great tragedy of our time that so many innocent people have been slaughtered. But legitimate resistance comes at a price. The reason why there is resistance is because the oppressor, the colonizer, the imperialist is unwilling to allow people to have their rights. That's why we saw so many people get killed So many people get massacred in revolutions, in liberation movements across Africa, across Asia, in your country, and in the Americas. It's inevitable. It is not something to be celebrated. It's something extraordinarily tragic. But I think you can celebrate the defeat of the oppressor, even though if it's not the ultimate defeat, but it is a defeat, in my opinion. It is a major defeat for the oppressor, in my opinion. You can celebrate that, but also mourn the tragedy that has been brought about by its crimes.
I want to follow up on the role of the US, as you mentioned. Donald Trump himself seems very uncertain when he was asked about the sustainability of the ceasefire. His new appointed ambassador to the United Nations, excuse me, Elise Stefanik, recently reiterated on camera that she believes in Israel's right to the biblical dominion. Um, and a lot of analysts in the Middle East are saying that the regard for the ceasefire, and if at all, that is followed by a reconstruction of Gaza through international aid, is contingent on the US administration's determination to push for peace in the region. What are your thoughts about the new administration in the United States as far as its policy in Palestine is concerned?
I don't think there's any reason to be optimistic. The United States is deeply influenced by Zionism, and the Zionists in the United States are a very powerful force. Uh, Zionists in the United States and in Palestine have a similar ideology, but the bulk of the Zionists are the powerful Zionists are in the United States. So their source of power comes from that country, and they, as we all know, have enormous influence over presidents, senators, congressmen and women, and people, and all decision makers in that country, and of course in Europe as well. So there's no reason at all to be optimistic about Trump or his people. After all, his son-in-law is a Zionist. He spoke about Gaza as if that land does not belong to the Palestinian people in the past, and Trump has made some very somewhat similar remarks recently as well about the future of Gaza. So we shouldn't be naive, and I don't think most people are naive. What Trump did, I think, though, was significant, that he pushed for a ceasefire. He needed a ceasefire before the inauguration. And I think it just shows how bad this is for the United States and how bad this is for U.S. hegemony. It shows that Trump does recognize that both inside the United States, public opinion has turned against the Israeli regime. Uh, even we should remember that even some of Trump's own supporters, staunch supporters, have turned against Israel. Uh, Tucker Carlson, for example, in his show, has spoken to people who are deeply hostile towards Netanyahu and the regime. He is a very influential person. Candace Owens has turned completely against the Israeli regime, and that I think reflects something bigger, or at least among Trump supporters. And of course, on the other side, the leftists, progressives, and many people who voted for or traditionally voted for the Democratic Party, they too have turned deeply against the Israeli regime. And as we all know, global public opinion is deeply hostile towards the regime as well. So it shows that the reality on the ground has impact, and I think Trump needed that ceasefire to for because he recognized the sea change in public opinion. But that does not mean that he is going to move to stop the genocidal behavior of the regime in the long term, let alone to punish anyone for carrying out the greatest crimes that we've seen in the 21st century, alongside, of course, the genocide in Yemen, which is often forgotten. The genocide in Yemen was supported by the United States, by the Europeans, by the Canadians, and it lasted for 7 years. And the people of Yemen survived that, and they became the most effective, or at least one of the two or three most effective forces in in hurting the Israeli regime during its genocide on Gaza.
I will come back to Yemen in a moment, but talking about not punishing the Zionist crimes, we are having very concrete reports from the West Bank. Jenin, which has been a traditional bastion of resistance since the time of the Second Intifada from the early 2000s, has been bombed by Israel, killing tens of people. But there are also others areas and towns near Nablus, Bethlehem, Ramallah that have been constantly raided. And what Al Jazeera is telling us is that people are now considering this as, of course, Trump has lifted sanctions on settlers. These are places in the Palestinian occupied West Bank's countryside. And what Al Jazeera is telling us is that people are seeing the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis as doing joint operations against the resistance. I wonder what your thoughts are on the PA in the occupied West Bank.
Well, unfortunately, the PA, as in colonial times, uh, has been the enforcer for the colonizer. We always saw that in all colonies throughout Africa, throughout Asia, throughout Southeast Asia or Latin America, that the the hegemon, the colonizer, the imperialists, they used local people uh, to enforce their domination. Whether you call it the house slave or the brown sahib or the comprador class or the West truck, it doesn't really matter. Actually, these different names or the Orientalized Oriental, these different names show, or these different terms show that across the world you have different terms for the same phenomenon. And that is basically that you will have these local people who have a vested interest in working or in collaborating with the hegemon. And the Palestine in the West Bank, it's the same thing. In fact, in Gaza, we also saw how during this 15, 16, over 15 months of genocide, the Israeli regime was cultivating gangs and groups in Gaza to attack convoys, to steal the food, so that it would not be distributed among ordinary people. So they would allow very limited fuel to get into Gaza, and then the gangs that are or and groups that are working with the Israeli regime and in effect being collaborators, they would attack those convoys and uh, set them on fire or steal them, and thus intensify starvation in Gaza. So even in Gaza, we saw that sort of thing. The difference, though, between the West Bank and Gaza is that in general, Gaza was controlled by Hamas and its allies. Islamic Jihad allowed Hamas to have full authority, and so they were able to control these gangs. In the West Bank, Bank, the Israeli regime has created this and look its bidding. So that's nothing new. This has been happening for a very long time. But what it does do in the West Bank, what the Israelis is being seen differently across the world than before. Because after the genocide in Gaza, people across in the West Bank. And I think the fact that Trump removed those sanctions, token sanctions, they weren't important sanctions. Um, it is symbolic that it shows that he is going to behave just like Biden, in that he will support the Israeli regime no matter what it does, as long as he can get away with it. The problem is that the world has changed. The West has changed. The world has changed. The balance of power in the region and the world has changed. The West likes to say, because they support apartheid and racism and genocide in Palestine, Western media, Western think tanks like to say that the Israeli regime has the upper hand, but in fact they don't. They've lost. They've lost the war for public opinion. They've lost on the border with Lebanon. They failed. They've achieved. They haven't. They were supposed to go all the way to the Litani River. Uh, they got nowhere near there. In Gaza, they were supposed to wipe out the resistance. It didn't happen. The only place where they did have success was in Netanyahu's alliance with Erdogan and Biden to overthrow the Syrian government. But even there, I think that these three, well, we don't know if he's really alive, but I think Erdogan and Netanyahu may regret what they did in Syria, because it seems like it is becoming a huge problem for them, and it could indeed cause instability in countries that are actually in the American camp, because these extremists have become very ambitious. So uh, the Israelis have failed, and uh, the Americans they do not have the power that they did before. Things in Ukraine are not going all that well either. The United States, Trump was he was supposed to end the war in Ukraine on day one, and so far it's been almost a week now, and there's no cease last. The weaker the Western camp becomes. It is. We all know how devastating the war in Afghanistan and Iraq was for Western economies and for American power. The war in Ukraine has been much worse. The direct and more importantly, the indirect costs of the war for the West, for the collective West, have been huge. The sanctions on Russia have devastated European economies. And while the Americans have benefited from this devastation, but on the whole, the Americans have lost a lot, because no power wants to have broken and weak allies, which become more of a burden than collaborators. So the fortunes of the West continue to decline, and the situation in the West Bank may deteriorate, but there's a huge Palestinian population there, and Gaza has not been subdued. It has not been defeated. And then there's Lebanon. So things may get much worse, but uh, but I don't see any chance for the Israeli regime to success, a road to success for the Israeli regime, whether it's in the West Bank or Gaza or Lebanon.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.